Hello everyone. Welcome to episode 14 of the 11FS Newsroom. My name is Kate Moody. In this weekly show, we take a deep dive into the biggest news story of the week just gone. Don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn so you never miss an episode. Before we get started, a quick tip for anyone looking to sharpen their competitive edge when it comes to design. You can join hundreds of subscribers using 11FS Pulse to solve their users' problems and get to market faster. Discover over 4,000 user journeys from global brands like Revolut, Curve, and Soldo, and many, many more, and learn how to design winning customer propositions with our expert analysis. You can get started today by visiting bit.ly/get-a-pulse-demo. Today, we are talking about a big story, how Monzo President Tom Blomfield has sadly announced his exit from the company. On top of the change, going from a startup to undoubtedly the large company that Monzo is today, Blomfield said that lockdown has had a big impact on his personal mental health. His very honest explanation of the departure has been applauded in the industry and has sparked conversations on the way that lockdown has impacted all of our mental well-being, and that's a conversation that we're really keen to carry on today. So joining me to talk further about this, we're delighted to have Bailey Kursar, the CEO and co-founder of Tuco. Welcome, Bailey.
Hello, lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right. It's lockdown 3. I think, like everyone, I'm tired and bored and in need of sunshine, but definitely counting my blessings as well. So, you know, good and bad. How about yourself, Kate? How are you today?
Yeah, not too bad. I've realised, I think I'm now on the verge of like the lockdown hair just getting slightly too long. So that's kind of the main stress at the moment. I didn't manage to time my pre-lockdown haircut strategically. So I think if we're recording this again in sort of 3 weeks' time, I think it's going to be very disastrous. But we'll cross that bridge. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. As always, people watching, we love getting your questions, so please leave them in the comments sidebar and we'll be answering them live for you as much as we possibly can. Bailey, to kick us off, it'd be great just to get an introduction to you, what you focus on and the work that you're doing at Tuco. That'd be great.
Yeah, of course. So I'm Bailey. I lead the team at Tuco. We've recently become more of a tech for good research lab, having kind of come from being a startup very focused on one particular use case, which was using open banking to help carers better manage money with the people that they care for. An app that we're still working on, still very much love. But at the moment, given the pandemic, we are actually doing other projects as well, really interesting, one of which I'll tell you about in a sec. Where I came from was I worked in fintech for the last 10 years. I worked at Monzo and other cool places, doing marketing and product and generally being kind of a startup, early stage startup generalist. And the reason that I started Tuco in the first place was because I've had intermittent mental health issues for the whole of my life. It became something that I was really passionate about, especially a few years ago, just before I started the company, researching how mental health and money management interact and the vicious cycle that can occur when people have mental health problems and can't manage their money. So that's why I'm here today, hopefully to talk more about mental health and talk about the progress that's hopefully being made in the industry.
Awesome, yeah. No, looking forward to getting into it and getting your perspective. I had heard rumours that there was a guide to inclusive design for financial services that you guys are about to launch. Could you give us a sneak preview of what you're doing there? Yes,
so that's one of the exciting projects that we've been able to do over the last few months. I've been working with Money Advice Trust and Fair by Design, both amazing charities that focus on financial inclusion, to produce a guide to inclusive design for essential services, very much focusing on vulnerability. So if you, the people out there, if your firm comes into contact with people going through difficult circumstances or may have like a vulnerability policy, it's definitely worth having a read and thinking about how you're going to use inclusive design to solve some of those problems. I won't go into it now, but it's all linked up to new FCA guidelines that are coming out around vulnerability this year. So lots to talk about vulnerability another time, but it's in a space that I know as an industry we can do a lot better. And I think inclusive design is going to really help us do that.
Okay, no, it sounds exciting. I'll definitely be checking out when it comes out. So, and yeah, as you say, vulnerability. Obviously, it's a topic that the FCA are focusing on, and it's something that the news story that we're looking at today touches on and kind of helps us to talk about. So I think that was why we were so keen to get your perspective. Obviously, Tom has made his announcement. It's a massive deal for him individually. It's a massive deal for Monzo as a company, but also we're starting to see the impact that leaders such as Tom talking openly about their struggles could potentially have, and the doors that it could open. So I'd love to get your take, just to start us off, what impact do you think this story will have on the way that we talk about mental health in a work environment?
I think it can have only positive outcomes in terms of helping everybody in the industry understand that talking more about how you're feeling and your energy levels is okay within the work environment. I still think there is a long way for us to go as an industry. I think we have made a lot of progress over the last few years when it comes to managing mental health, but actually it's a bigger conversation than just Tom having one interview. But I do think, I'm really lucky to have worked for Tom and had the experience of his leadership. I think he's a great leader in that he will let people into that part of his, thinking, and also take people on a journey with how he's feeling. And I think this is a part of that. This is hopefully a good template for other startup founders to look at and to take notes from. I do think there's been, in the tech industry generally, lots of founders who've talked in retrospect about the struggles that they've had, but might not have used this kind of language. So I think that's where we're coming to now. One thing that this made me think of was one of my favorite books of all time, The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz, if you've read it, which is all about the struggles that he had as a first time and as an entrepreneur generally, actually, not just his first time, and really going into the depths of the lack of sleep and the worry and all of that impact that has on you as a leader. So I think if we can open up and just be really honest about how that makes leaders feel, I think it can only encourage a better management of that going forward.
No, absolutely. I totally agree. And I suppose, obviously, you're leading a business, a company yourself. So I'm really interested in the two angles of it. One, the conversation opens up for company leaders, people leading businesses, and how they perceive their own options and choices in terms of how they lead those businesses. But secondly, I suppose for the teams that work underneath them and the wider groups of employees, what example does that set? What kind of culture does that create in terms of talking about mental health more widely in the workplace?
Yeah, I think your point is the right one in that it's got to start at the top. I think it's great as well for people in companies who are kind of on the front line, part of a much bigger organization, to see Tom's example and others' examples and to start talking about it with their own colleagues. But actually to have a much larger impact culturally in a company, I think it really does have to come from the top and from the people who are most likely really to have that pressure on them. I can tell you, and it won't come as any surprise, but as a founder, you're kind of always thinking about, how am I going to get that next round of funding? Am I doing the right things in the product? Are we letting our customers down? How am I going to make sure I can pay payroll next month? I mean, at every single stage of a startup's evolution, there will be worries and pressure put on the founders. And so from my point of view, being open as possible about that, while still recognizing that you are a leader, can improve the way that people in the organization talk themselves about mental health and the pressures that they're under. And I think for me, wrapped into all of this is a conversation that we need to have in the industry more about burnout, because actually the leading cause of burnout is overwork. So it's easy for us to say, let's talk about mental health and we can make it better. And undoubtedly we can improve things if we talk about it more. But actually it's a bigger issue than that. We need to be a more inclusive workplace. We need to recognize people's contributions. We need to make sure that people aren't working in a way that is unhealthy for that person. So I'll get off my high horse for a second. But I think that we still have a long way to go. But compared to the industry that I started in 2010, I think we've made a lot of changes, and I think it's really positive.
Yeah, I think some of the languages you mentioned that Tom used in that interview was really powerful, and in terms of being a bit more transparent about it than we've seen in maybe some other instances. So I think he used a quote, he realised he was doing too much and not enjoying it. And I think that sort of sounds like a sentiment that maybe lots of people might recognise in themselves and not necessarily make that connection to it being kind of that first sign of what we might label as burnout, and something that sounds very scary and big. So I think some of that language was really interesting. The other aspect of the interview that I found personally really interesting was the way that Tom talked about the support that he'd had from his board and from the kind of the rest of the exec team at Monzo. So he talked about how he'd been able, actually from quite a while ago, to have these conversations at that level, and they talked about different options for him in terms of how he could manage it, or different approaches that he could take. So I think that was really interesting, the role that a board or a senior exec team plays in supporting that, and what kind of responsibilities investors have or board members have to look for these kinds of signs as well.
Absolutely. And it's a broader point than that, even, because you've got Tom, you've got this amazing board around him, you've got experienced people there, but actually all of us, whether we're in a big company and working on things that are kind of on the front line, or we're in a startup, we all have similar structures of colleagues around us and people who might be our manager, or we might be accountable to, like investors. And so I think it really is about how we can recognize these things in others, and also just be a helpful ear. I've got one colleague whose childcare issues have meant she's not been able to have the hours at work that she normally has. One colleague several colleagues who had their families in a completely different country. I mean, that's anxiety inducing when you're in lockdown for so long. One colleague, she had caring responsibilities, and so actually that's an added challenge, especially in lockdown, and yeah, you can imagine. So all of these things on top of the obvious ones of we're all stuck inside, we're sociable animals, we really need that interaction, especially when you're in an innovative environment. I'm sure you get this too, Kate. Like, for me personally, I love being around people and having that buzz. And I think added to that, the kind of pressure financially, where people might not necessarily have the income that they had, or might not have the government support. So all of those are issues. We all know about those. It's very unfortunate, but it's in the news every single day. I think from a practical point of view, if you're a manager in a team, definitely just asking the question, how are you? What do you need from me? Sounds really obvious, but we found at the beginning of lockdown, because we had some new employees at that point, they weren't kind of putting their hand up and going, actually, I need an office chair at home, my back's hurting. It's really silly things like that, and that has a massive impact over time. Also, myself and my colleagues talk very, very openly about our own struggles and mental health, so that opens the door, I think, for people in the team. One other thing I was saying was retrospectives. In each of our retrospectives, we made a point of asking about how people's kind of personal lives were, how they were personally. And the last thing that I was mentioning was we did a user manuals project for each of the members of our team. So I can't remember the exact questions, but we went through and kind of answered a specific questionnaire and then shared that with the whole team. Things like, what time of day do you prefer to have meetings? What are the things that really sap your energy? What are things that people often misunderstand about you? These kinds of things just really helped open up the conversation, so that all of our colleagues could kind of understand what was the best environment to thrive in. And I think, given we're going to be working remotely potentially for a while now, I think these are really good exercises for teams to be doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm definitely going to steal some of those and take some of those back into 11FS if the team aren't already on it.
I'll send you a template. Yeah, use a template.
I think obviously there's various different stats around this as well. Obviously, it makes total sense when we talk about it as something that you would just want to help improve for your employees and for your teams. But there is a sort of a business impact of not addressing these issues in a really sort of hands-on way. So I think Alt5 published a study where the data showed that 3/4 of people say they've never discussed their mental health with their employers, and only a fifth said that they would feel comfortable doing so. So I think that's part of the reason why stories like this, obviously we're interested in the personal angle for Tom and for Monzo, but hopefully, and actually something that's more exciting is whether this could, as we talked about earlier, create that precedent that companies can now start to, from the top down, start to talk about mental health in a much more open way.
Yeah, I really hope so. It doesn't. So I think there's been several companies that I've worked at in the last few years, and obviously with Tuco, that have done this in a much more progressive way. But this is still an industry where I can imagine a lot of people feeling like they can't talk to their boss about this stuff. Like, I won't name names, but I remember one time talking to a boss and saying, like, I'm working 80-hour weeks, I can't do this, I'm really tired. And then saying, like, only 80-hour weeks. that was the response, right? So you're like, okay, if you're in a culture like that, where do you go and how do you think about that? And I think you're absolutely right. If you as an employee can point out some of these precedents to your manager, to the people at the top, hopefully that can help them understand that this isn't about kind of success and failure. It's just about how people address being human. You know, what you've got to be a human as well as a productive member of the team, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a couple of questions that are coming from people tuning in. So Natalia's asked, how can we encourage leaders to start talking about such topics? So obviously, you know, people who might have read about Tom we've seen some stuff on LinkedIn where business leaders already started to come out and share their own experiences. But, you know, for leaders that maybe haven't come across this or haven't encountered some of these types of stories, have you got any tips for broaching that with them or encouraging that conversation?
Yeah, I think it's hard. I think having examples out there is inevitably going to make it more acceptable for people to do so. But ultimately, people have to recognize in themselves what they want to talk about and be able to talk about it in the way that matches their personality. So there's no template, I think, for how this works. Most important thing, I suppose, is authenticity. So actually being able to come out and talk about the things that you find challenging. I've found opening yourself up and being vulnerable can really improve how people interact with you and your company, and they'll probably kind of have things to help as well. So, you know, there are definitely benefits, but I don't think that every single leader should do exactly this. You know, it's going to look different for different leaders, how they do that authenticity piece. Does that answer the question? What do you think, Kate?
No, I think I agree. It's very difficult to have a standardized approach. I think so our CEO David, I think, is very open on LinkedIn about some things we're doing as a business, but we also have, I suppose there's the things you do externally as a business, and then there's the things that you do internally. So the little things you talk about on Slack or whichever kind of comms channels you use, just opening up about the successes that you have, but also the struggles, and really reinforcing kind of the need to take that time off as kind of something that I've seen be impactful kind of within our business. So we've got one more question from, apologies if I mispronounced her name, Yazgul has asked, any books that you would recommend on the correlation between mental health and financial well-being, or just general good place to go to find out more about the kind of correlation between the two?
I like an easy question. So there are no books. Well, that's a lie. There are books, but none that I would recommend. What I would do is go to the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute's website. They have, I think, around 20, maybe even more reports now that they've put together around specific issues. But also, if you go back to the first couple of reports they did, it's a much broader look at the vicious cycle that is money mismanagement and poor mental health. And they're just seen globally, actually, as a leader in that space. So I would definitely have a look at that. And yeah, that's an easy question to answer.
No, always good to have some easy ones. Conscious of time, so I suppose I've got plenty more things I could ask. But one thing I wanted to, obviously we've talked a little about the work you guys do at Tuco, looking at carers and supporting carers. Are they, I imagine they're an audience where they're under quite unique pressures or even sort of more extreme pressures. So what sort of support do you think is available? Is there enough support available for those types of individuals to manage work and life at the moment?
No is the answer. It's really, and one thing that I saw earlier today that I think really summed it up was, people talk about the pandemic as being a leveler, but it really isn't. In fact, it's the opposite. What it's done is it's taken all the inequalities and the struggles that happened before the pandemic and it's heightened them. And care work of all kinds, whether it's childcare for parents, whether it's informal care for a relative who needs that care, or it might even be professional care. All of these people have been struggling in different ways pre-pandemic, and with lockdown and the economic pressures of work at the moment, it's much, much more heightened. What we're seeing, unfortunately, is a very unequal impact, particularly gender-wise, in the way that job losses and income impact around the pandemic is happening. And unfortunately or fortunately, women are more likely to be carers of every type. So yeah, I think one thing that would be good to kind of get across, I suppose, is if you are an employer, if you're a team leader, just be mindful about the different types of care that your employees, your staff might be having to juggle, because it's not just the kind of traditional childcare that someone might have. They might also be having to support financially a relative, or they might need to make sure that a relative is stocked up because they're shielding. And there might be other kinds of care that are happening that you just don't know about, you don't see. And that impacts employees both from a time point of view, having to make sure that they can juggle that, but also from a mental health point of view, it's a huge pressure having that care responsibility. And it can be really draining, and it leads to, we talked about burnout. So yeah, I haven't much kind of good things to say in terms of positive hope coming out.
I saw Zurich, for example, in the UK have announced that they're giving employees with care responsibilities 10 paid days of care leave. So do you think more companies will start? Does that actually help? Does that make a difference? Or
I think that's a great start. I mean, in certain, I didn't know about that. That's a good one. I will keep that for next time. But yeah, in certain age brackets, so between the age of about 40 and 50, a huge proportion of people will be having some care responsibilities of an elderly relative. So it's not just, like I say, the childcare element. It's things like, people are effectively working part-time hours doing care work on top of a normal job. So it's something that a lot of employers need to think more about. But equally, I think having more flexible work as we work more remotely, there's a lot of potential there for really helping people find a better work-life balance. But a lot of the problems that are happening at the moment come from government. So I'm hoping that both what we talk about and the charities that we've worked with as well, we can help impact policy around how care is thought about, and how we can financially reward people who do this amazing job for people. It's often the case that carers are on less than minimum wage because they have to pay for their own travel, and informal carers allowance is a very pitiful amount, and also a lot of carers aren't able to qualify. So again, that's a whole separate discussion, but I think hopefully the one good thing I could say is the pandemic has at least shone a light on that. And so hopefully both government and employers will start to think differently about how they can make sure that care work is recognised. Yeah, clapping for carers is all well and good, but need to pay them a fair wage, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Fingers crossed that this pandemic, amongst all of the many horrendous things that it's brought with it, will help us to appreciate different parts of our society and the kind of the structural supports that we all rely on without necessarily even realizing, just to keep things going. So sadly, I think we're going to have to come to the end of the show. I'm sure everyone watching it has other things that they have to get to, but thanks so much for joining me, Bailey. Where can people find out more about you and what you're doing at 2Co?
Thanks so much, Kate. You can go to use2co.com. That's TOUCO. And you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Bailey Kersar. And yeah, thanks so much for having me.
No, thanks for joining us and for giving your perspective on a super important topic. So, and thanks everyone for joining. We wish Tom all the best with kind of whatever he goes on to do next, and excited to see him kind of come back fully refreshed and bringing his creativity and his leadership and energy to the industry once again, whatever he decides to do. So to make sure you don't miss out on any of our future shows, follow 11FS on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks very much. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.